When my phone rang at 2 in the morning, I knew the Cole family was officially ruined. On the other end of the line was my mother's choked back, sobbing, my father's trembling, broken voice, and the humiliated silence of Derek, my brilliant lawyer of a brother. They needed money. They needed the exact lifeblood keeping this entire dynasty afloat. But what they didn't know was that the only person holding their why was the very son they had spent a lifetime treating as a footnote. The truth is, their fate had already been sealed 6 months prior, at my father's 70th birthday party. In front of 31 high society guests, Derek stood up, tapped his wine glass, and looked me dead in the eye with the smug smile of a man who had never tasted defeat. "Let's raise a glass to my brother, Mason," he said. "Still out there fixing wires for strangers. Somebody's got to do the manual labor, right?" The table erupted. A sharp, condescending laugh. My father smiled in slow approval. My mother nodded in tight, social resignation. They looked at me like a failure, a lowly handyman staining the prestigious Cole name. I didn't utter a word. I calmly set my glass down, finished my beef, and drove home, in the freezing silence of my own flesh and blood's rejection. But there was one terrifying truth they didn't know. At 7 o'clock the very next morning, I signed 4 classified documents. The total value of the acquisition for my energy infrastructure corporation was exactly $94 million. I wasn't out there fixing wires for strangers. I owned the grid that powered the entire city's wealth. For 6 months, I stayed dead silent. I watched them gloat, watched them drive themselves into a financial abyss, and patiently waited for the day they would have to drop to their knees and beg the handyman they so deeply despised. And now, that moment had arrived. Let me tell you exactly how I dismantled all 3 of them in less than half a year, starting from the very beginning. My name is Mason Cole. I'm 47 years old. I live outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house with a half-acre yard, 2 garages, and a workshop in the back that my wife Carla jokes is the most expensive garage in the state of North Carolina. She's probably right. I spent $14,000 on the tool storage system alone. Carla pointed this out once, calmly, over dinner. I told her it was an investment. She said, "In what?" I said, "In not losing my metric sockets." She said, "Okay, Mason," which is her specific way of ending conversations she has already won. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania, steel country. My father, Raymond Cole, spent 31 years as a production supervisor at Allegheny Steel. He wore the same steel-toe boots to work for 20 years, had them resoled twice, threw them out only when the third set of soles refused to hold. He knew every foreman in the plant by first name. He understood output, efficiency, shift schedules, and the particular satisfaction of a production run that finished on time without incident. He was a serious man. Not cold. Not unkind, not in the way some fathers are cold and unkind, and leave damage that takes decades to identify. Raymond Cole was simply a man who had spent his entire professional life in an environment where things either worked or they didn't. Where there was always a number, a quota, a measurement, a rating. And he brought that frame home with him every evening and never fully took it off. My brother, Derek, is 4 years older than me. He is the kind of son my father understood from the very beginning of Derek's life. Organized, decisive, good at standardized tests. He could sit at a desk for 4 hours. He remembered the rules of things. He liked winning and was good at predicting the conditions under which winning was likely. Derek won a scholarship, went to Pitt, graduated ahead of schedule, got into law school at a good regional firm, passed the bar examination on his first attempt, which is not guaranteed, which is a real thing. My father told the story of Derek's bar exam results at every family gathering for 6 years running. Not because Derek asked him to repeat it, because Raymond Cole needed a story like that needed a concrete, verifiable, socially legible fact that he could put in front of people and say, "This is what we produced. This is what the Cole name means." I was different from Derek in ways that took me most of my adult life to describe accurately. I was not a troubled student. I was not lazy. I was not distracted or ungrateful or aimless. I was the kind of boy who learned by doing, not by reading about doing. At 15, I pulled apart the engine of a 1968 Ford Galaxy that a neighbor was about to scrap and put it back together in working order. Mostly from a manual I borrowed from the school library and read in 3 days. At 16, I rewired the electrical panel in our garage after figuring out it was misgrounded, using a code book I found at a public library book sale for $1.50. My father came home from work, saw what I'd done, tested every outlet, and said, "That's correct." Then he went inside. That was it. That was the full review. I understood how systems connected before I had language for what systems were. I could look at a wiring diagram and understand where the current wanted to go before I understood the math behind it. I could look at a building layout and understand the load before anyone explained load calculation to me. My father watched all of this and did not know what to do with it. He wasn't hostile about it. He wasn't contemptuous. He was confused. He'd ask me what I wanted to do after high school. I'd say something about electrical work, about licensed trades, about building my own operation someday. He'd nod. Not the nod that means agreement or understanding. The nod that means a man is quietly, methodically, downwardly revising his expectations and trying not to let you see him do it. Derek was home from law school for Christmas the year I told Raymond I wasn't going to a 4-year university. I was 17. I wanted to do a 2-year electrical trade program and get licensed as fast as I could. I had researched the program. I knew the curriculum. I had a plan. Derek didn't even look up from his phone. He said, "Smart." The word that sounds like approval and performs the function of dismissal. My mother, Patricia, pressed her lips together the way she did when something was happening that she didn't know how to stop and didn't want to be blamed for. She said, "We just want to make sure you're not limiting yourself, Mason." My father said, "You know what the ceiling looks like in that kind of work," I said. "I've been inside the ceiling, Dad. I know exactly what it looks like." Nobody laughed. That was not the kind of family we were. I finished the electrical trade program in 18 months, 8 weeks faster than the listed completion time. I got my journeyman's license at 20. Master electrician certification by 22. I worked commercial jobs in Pittsburgh, first office buildings, a hospital expansion, a municipal parking structure, 2 large format warehouses on the east side. I was fast and clean, and I read drawings the first time through without needing them explained to me a second time. At 24, I started taking jobs under my own name. 2 or 3 a month. Then more. The money was not yet serious money, but it was mine. And it was growing. And I could feel the shape of what it could become if I kept building the right way. My family treated the business like a hobby that hadn't failed yet. When Derek made partner at 31, my parents threw a dinner party for 14 people. Real tablecloths from the linen closet that only came out for significant occasions. A cake from the Shady Side Bakery with Derek's name on it in gold lettering. I sat at the end of the table and ate my chicken and listened to Raymond tell the story of the bar exam results for what I estimated was the 22nd time in my life. I watched Derek receive it all with the practiced modesty of a man who has been receiving this particular kind of admiration for so long that he has developed a specific facial expression for it. When I registered Cole Electrical Solutions as an LLC and received my electrical contractor's license, which required separate testing and documentation, and is a real professional credential, my mother called to ask if I needed help organizing the paperwork. Like I was filing for a booth at a community craft fair. I said I was fine. She said she hoped it worked out. That was the extent of it. I want you to understand this clearly. In 21 years of running my company, my father asked me about my work, real questions, specific questions. What does your company actually do? Questions 4 times. I remember each conversation precisely. All 4 happened in years when something had visibly gone wrong in my business. He was checking the scope of the failure he was still half expecting to arrive. Derek never asked. Not once in 23 years. Patricia asked periodically whether we were comfortable. By which she meant could we pay our bills, and when I said yes. She said good, and the conversation moved on. This is what a family does when they have decided what you are. They don't update the file. They don't revise when evidence comes in. They carry the old version forward and make small adjustments to the language only. When the evidence becomes impossible to interpret any other way. Darla, I need to tell you about Carla before I go further. Because Carla is the reason I didn't stop. I met her at 25. She was an emergency room nurse at UPMC. Presbyterian. She worked the overnight shift 3 times a week and had been doing it for 2 years already when I met her. She was the kind of person who saw the worst possible thing, the right people. We were set up by a mutual friend at a dinner party that I almost didn't go to because I had a proposal due the next morning and thought I could use the time better. I'm glad I went. She was direct. Not aggressive. Just honest in a way that didn't feel like it required work or maintenance. She asked real questions and waited for real answers. On our 3rd date, she asked me something that no one in my family had ever asked. She said, "What are you building?" Not what are you doing? Not what's your job? What are you building? I looked at her across the table for a second, because I wasn't sure she actually wanted the full answer. She did. I could tell. I told her everything. I want a commercial and industrial electrical company. I want a team of people who are serious and good at their work. I want contracts with companies that need real infrastructure, not outlet replacements, not residential work, but the kind of electrical systems that run industrial facilities and data centers and large commercial buildings. I want recurring revenue. I want margins that make sense. I want to build something that doesn't disappear when I walk out of the room. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Okay. How do I help?" That was the whole conversation. I knew I was going to marry her approximately 3 days later. Though I didn't say so for another year. We married when I was 27. Small ceremony. Carla's family came, her parents, her sister, a handful of close friends. My parents came. Derek came with his wife Natasha, who shook Carla's hand at the reception with the careful, pleasant politeness of a person who has been briefed on a distant relative. They're meeting for the first time, and are trying to be appropriate about. My father gave a toast. He said I was a good son. He said Carla was a lovely woman. He said he hoped the business worked out. He did not say he was proud. He did not say he was happy. He said he hoped it worked out. I remember thinking, that's all right. I'll show him. I was still thinking like that in those years. That if I built something real enough and visible enough and undeniable enough, they would eventually be forced to revise. That the evidence would become so clear and so large that they'd have no choice but to update the file. That belief cost me years I could have spent building for its own sake. Without the backward glance. But the thing that actually made Carla stop asking me to keep trying with them, the specific thing that made her sit across from me one night and say, enough, wasn't anything they said to me. It was what they did to her. At 8 consecutive Christmas dinners, Natasha organized the Cole family Christmas gatherings for 8 straight years. She was meticulous about it in a way that made you understand that the meticulous organization was itself a communication. That the level of effort being displayed was meant to be noticed and admired and discussed later. She had a gift for making things look effortless, while making absolutely clear how much effort had gone into them. She sourced the right champagne. She coordinated the table linens. She printed little place cards with calligraphy names. She had opinions about dessert. She also had a talent for seating. In 8 years of Christmas dinners, Carla and I were never seated at the main family table. Not once. Not one single time in 8 years. There was always a reason. The table was slightly too small this year. We'd confirmed late, so the main seating was already set. There was actually a much nicer spot near the window where we'd have more room. Natasha would explain it with such smooth, practiced regret, the regret of a woman who genuinely wished things could be different, but, unfortunately, the logistics that there was no clean way to challenge it without sounding paranoid. Carla never made a scene about it. She would find her chair at the side table and talk to whoever was nearby with exactly the same full attention she gave everyone. She was better at it than I was. I noticed her doing it working the table, making the people around her feel seen and heard and felt something I didn't have a name for. The 4th year, after the dessert plates had been cleared and people were finding their coats, Carla pulled me into the hallway of my parents' house and closed the door to the dining room behind us. Her voice was quiet. Her face was very still. She said, "Mason, I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it without getting defensive." I said, "Okay." She said, "We are not welcome here. We have been told that 8 times across 8 Christmas dinners with a seating chart. I understand why you keep trying, but I need you to know that I am not going to sit at that table anymore. Not because I'm angry, because it's not honest. And I don't do things that aren't honest." I said. "Carla," she said, "I know. I know why it matters to you. I'm not asking you to stop caring about your family. I'm asking you to stop bringing me somewhere I'm told every single year that I don't fully belong." I had no counter to that. She was right in a way that didn't have a good response. The seating arrangement was real. The message it sent was real. The fact that no one had ever said it directly made it worse, not better. We stopped going after that Christmas. My mother called in January to ask why we hadn't been in touch. I said we'd had other commitments over the holidays. She said she hoped it wasn't because Carla was being difficult. I said, "Carla is the least difficult person I have ever known." My mother said, "Well, I certainly hope that's true." I hung up. Carla was in the other room. She'd heard the flat note in my voice. She didn't ask what had been said. She already knew the shape of it. We built our own life. That was the deliberate choice. Clean distance. No drama. No ultimatum. Just a slow and honest removal of ourselves from a room where we had been assigned the wrong seats for 8 consecutive years and given a polite reason every time. But Derek found another way in. I'm going to tell you about 43 emails. I didn't know they existed until my attorney discovered them during an acquisition. Due diligence review more than 9 years after they were sent. When Rachel laid the first one face up on her desk and slid it across to me, I read it once. Read it a second time. Then I turned it face down, placed both hands flat on the desk, and sat there in complete silence for a full minute. The emails were from my brother. Sent to the people who were about to become my 3 largest contracts. We had been pushing into the mid-Atlantic market for nearly 2 years. I wanted commercial and industrial electrical contracts in the $2 to $5 million range. Specifically data center infrastructure and large commercial systems work with companies that had serious capital, budgets, and long-term facility needs. I had developed relationships over 2 years. Sent formal proposals to 14 companies. 3 of them were exceptional fits, national and regional. Companies with major facility projects in progress, serious procurement processes, and the right kind of organizational maturity to want a specialized systems partner, rather than a generic, low-bid contractor. All 3 went silent within the same 6-week window. Two stopped returning calls with no explanation. One sent a one-paragraph decline that said they were going in a different direction and thanked us for our time. I assumed we'd been outcompeted on price or scope or relationships. It happens in every business. You recalibrate, you learn what you can, and you build the pipeline stronger. That's the job. What I did not know, could not know, had no way to know, was that Derek Cole of Cole, Hartley and Briggs, attorney at law, had professional connections to two of those three companies through his firm's corporate work. He had introduced himself to decision-makers at both using the Cole name, using the firm's reputation, using the polished, confident authority that 20 years of practicing law in Pittsburgh had given him. And then he had written about me. The emails were not aggressive. That was the most devastating thing about them. A lawyer does not send aggressive emails in a situation like this. A lawyer sends professional, considered, carefully constructed emails that could survive scrutiny if they were ever forwarded to the wrong person. Derek's emails said he was professionally concerned about the fit between his family's contracting business and the procurement needs of these companies. He used phrases like limited operational scale for projects of this complexity, and some recent instability in their management structure. From what I understand, and as someone with family insight into their operations, I wanted to flag this in the interest of due diligence. As I know you have limited time for vendor vetting. He mentioned my company by name. He mentioned the family relationship. He positioned himself as someone reluctantly sharing private knowledge in the interest of the client's protection. Every word was deniable. Every implication was clear. Every email accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. 3 contracts. My attorney put the conservative combined revenue value at $11 million. She ran it through the growth model we were using for the acquisition preparation, and came back with an enterprise value impact of approximately $25 million. My brother had cost me $25 million. When Rachel told me this sitting across from me in her office with the documentation spread out on the conference table, I did not raise my voice. I did not react dramatically. I sat in my chair and I looked at the table, and I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, document everything. All 43 emails. Full thread where it exists. Date, recipient, content, and the connection between recipient and our lost contracts. She said, you have a strong defamation case. I said, I know. I don't want to sue him. She said, Mason. I said, not yet. Maybe not ever. Document everything and put it in a folder. I'll tell you when I want to use it. I drove home. I went to the workshop. I stood at my workbench and looked at my tools. I did not do anything. I just stood there for a while. Then I went inside. I didn't tell Carla for 3 weeks. I knew what would happen when I did. I knew her well enough to know exactly what her face would do, and what she would say. And I needed to think about what I wanted to do with the information before her response locked something in. When I finally sat down with her at the kitchen table and told her everything, the emails, the 3 contracts, the $25 million in enterprise value, the 9 years of not knowing, she was very still for a long time. Not the worried kind of still, the settled kind. The kind that comes when something you half suspected has been confirmed and now you know the full shape of it. She said, he did this because he was scared of what you were going to become. I said, what gives him the right to be scared of what I become? She said, nothing. Nothing gives him that right. We sat with that for a moment. She said, what do you want to do? I said, keep building. Faster. She said, okay. That was the decision. No lawsuit. No confrontation. No phone call. No letting him know that I knew. I kept building deliberately, methodically. Every single day, and I never once let the knowledge slow me down or redirect my attention. I let it sit where it needed to sit. I let it be what it was. I hired 2 senior project directors that year. I expanded into 3 additional states. I brought in Diane Walsh as CFO after a 6-month search process that I ran as carefully as any major contract negotiation. Diane had come from a larger regional firm and had a specific expertise in financial positioning for acquisition targets. She understood what acquirers looked for, how to build the story, the numbers needed to tell, and how to close the gap between what a company actually was and what the right buyer would eventually pay for it. She sat across from me in her first week and said, "Tell me everything. What this company does, what it's worth in your head, and what you want it to be worth in someone else's." I told her. She said, "I can help you get there. But it's going to take real work and it's going to take time." I said, "I know. That's why I hired you." She smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed she'd made the right decision. We worked together for 6 years after that. She was the most important professional relationship of my career. Derek didn't understand what I was doing because he didn't have the frame to understand what the company had become. He was still looking at the file from 2005, the version of me who was a regional electrical contractor with a small team and a modest revenue base. He didn't see the systems integrator. He didn't see the EBITDA margin improvement. He didn't see the acquisition positioning. He didn't see any of it. That was his second significant mistake in relation to me. The first was sending those emails without understanding that I would eventually have the resources to find out. My father turned 70 in September of the year the deal was moving into final stages. Patricia called 3 weeks before to tell me about the dinner. 40 people. The Highland Park Club, where Raymond had been a member for 22 years, dress appropriately. Carla was welcome, of course. It would be nice if we were there. That last phrase, "it would be nice if you were there," was Patricia's way of applying exactly the right amount of social pressure. Enough to register, not enough to give me anything clean to push back against. I told Carla. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "We should go." I said, "We don't have to." She said, "I know we don't have to. We should. Not for them, for you. So that after tonight, you have a clear, honest picture of where things stand. No more ambiguity. No more wondering. You go in there, you sit at whatever table they put you at. You watch how they treat you, and you bring it home, and you know." That was exactly what she meant. Not hoping something good would happen. Not setting a trap. Just go in with your eyes open and come out knowing. We drove to Pittsburgh on a Friday afternoon. Checked into a hotel on the north side, close to the club. Changed into the right clothes, the clothes you wear when you're attending an event where the clothes matter. Arrived at 7:15 on the dot. The club was exactly as I remembered it. From the handful of events I'd attended there over the years. Dark wood paneling. Heavy drapes. The particular smell of old money and good carpet, and a bar that had been there since before anyone currently standing in it was born. Raymond's world. Fully his territory in a way that no space had been quite that clearly his since he retired from the plant. My father was near the entrance when we came in. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him 18 months before, at a cousin's wedding. Still a big man, but the size had settled differently, moved lower the way it does in men past a certain age, when the frame starts to make compromises it didn't used to make. He hugged me. One arm. "Firm," he said. "Good you came." That was the greeting. Present tense. Acknowledged obligation. Not glad you're here. Not I've missed you. Not I've been looking forward to seeing you. Good you came. Carla got the same arm hug and a Carla, glad you could make it. Patricia came over and kissed her cheek in the way that performs warmth without containing any, and steered her immediately toward a group of women from the church circle. Derek and Natasha were already deep in the room when we arrived. Natasha gave Carla the air kiss, the practiced European greeting she had adopted at some point in her marriage as a signal of social sophistication, and then immediately turned to find someone more productively interesting to talk to. Derek shook my hand. "Mason," he said. "Business holding up?" I said. "Business is strong." He did the nod. The same recalibrating nod that my father had done at the kitchen table in Pittsburgh 30 years earlier. The nod that means I'm filing this claim for later investigation. Dinner was a long, well-organized, smoothly catered event that moved through its courses with the precision of things that have been done many times in the same room. I sat at the table. I talked to a cousin about her kid's school situation. I talked to one of my father's former work colleagues about the state of the steel industry. I ate carefully. I drank 1 glass of wine. I watched. Watching was the thing I'd become very good at by that point in my life. You learn it when you've spent years being underestimated. Not the bitter kind of watching, not the resentful kind, but the clear-eyed, information-gathering kind, that comes from understanding that the most useful data in any room is usually not in what people say, but in how they behave when they think the stakes are low. The stakes were high. Nobody in that room knew that except Carla and me. Then the toast started. A family friend went first. Long, warm, genuine tribute to Raymond Cole, the plant man, the father, the husband, the community member. It was real, and it was good. And Raymond received it with the particular dignity of a man who has been told he mattered by people he respects. Then Derek stood up. He had clearly thought about this. The length was calibrated. The tone was calibrated. He talked about Raymond's work ethic and what it had built. About the family that work ethic had sustained. About the obligation of children to carry forward what their parents had put into them. He mentioned his own law firm 3 times. I counted. 3 references in 4.5 minutes, each one casual and seemingly incidental, each one doing exactly the work it was designed to do. Placing Derek Cole in the same sentence as professional success and institutional credibility, and the kind of achievement that Raymond Cole had always understood how to point at. He said, "You built sons who understood what it meant to work hard. To build something that lasts. To take the Cole name and make it mean something wherever we go." He paused. Then he looked directly at me. The shift was subtle. A slight angle of the head. The smile that came on like a lamp being switched, warm, engaged, performatively affectionate. He said, "And let's raise a glass to Mason. My brother. My brother." The smile held. Still out there fixing wires for strangers. He spread his hand slightly. The gesture of a man including everyone in an inside joke. Somebody's got to keep the lights on, right? The laugh started in the middle of the table, and moved outward. My father's mouth curved. My father's oldest friend chuckled. 3 of my cousins laughed. Derek's father-in-law smiled in the way men smile at toasts. They don't entirely understand but feel they are supposed to appreciate. Natasha caught Carla's eye across the table and smiled. Carla smiled back. I watched the exchange and understood everything in it. I want to tell you exactly what was happening inside me during those few seconds. Nothing. Genuine, complete, peaceful nothing. Not suppressed rage. Not grief. Not the tight, silent shame I'd felt at 23 when a version of this same dynamic had made me want to disappear from the room. None of that was there. Because I was 46 years old and I had spent 23 years building something that no one at that table could see yet. And the laugh that moved around the dining room of the Highland Park Club hit the outside of me and slid off completely. Like rain off a finished roof. I was so far past the place where their version of me had any weight that the laugh registered as information and nothing else. Useful information, actually. Because it told me that nothing had changed. That they were exactly who they had always been. That the evening was going to confirm what Carla had told me it would confirm, and I could go home with that. I let the laugh run its course. Then I picked up my wine glass. I looked at Derek across those 31 people, all of them still half smiling, waiting to see how the handyman responded when the lawyer made the joke, and I said, quietly, You're right, Derek. Somebody does. The room shifted. Not a gasp. Barely a sound. More like the collective drawing of breath that happens when people realize that something more than a toast is happening. When the atmosphere changes in a way that everyone feels, but no one can immediately name. Derek's smile didn't drop. He was too practiced for that. But something behind it changed, something in the eyes, some small recalculation that happened fast and almost invisible. He held the glass up one more second and sat down. My father's expression went very carefully neutral. The expression of a man who has been in enough tense situations to know when something needs to be absorbed without comment. Natasha looked at the table in front of her with sudden concentrated interest. Two of the cousins looked at each other. Carla, across the table from me, was completely still. I knew from 20 years of marriage that complete stillness meant she was holding something back, something she would tell me in the car, in the dark, at highway speed, when we were alone and away from it. I set my glass down. I picked up my fork. I ate the rest of my dinner. At the end of the evening I found my father near the exit. I shook his hand. He held it one beat longer than was strictly necessary, looked at me in a way that I couldn't immediately read, and opened his mouth. He closed it again. I waited. He didn't find the words. "Good dinner," he said. "Good dinner," I said. I got Carla. We got our coats. We drove to the hotel. In the elevator, she said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm good." She said, "He was scared tonight." I watched him. When you said that, somebody does. He flinched. He hid it fast. But I saw it. I said, "He should be scared." She said, "The deal closes Thursday?" I said, "Thursday." She said, "Okay." We slept in the hotel. We drove home the next morning through Pennsylvania autumn cold clear air. The hills going orange and red and gold in the way they do in October. The kind of light that makes everything look like it has been there forever and always will be. I drove. And didn't say much. Carla read something on her phone. The dog would be happy to see us when we got home. I thought about the ceiling. I thought about Thursday. I want to stop here and make something very clear about the calendar. 3 days before my father's birthday dinner. 72 hours before Derek stood up with that wine glass. I had received a finalized term sheet from Meridian Infrastructure Group, a publicly traded company. 800 employees. Operations in 14 states. They had been watching Coal Integrated Power Solutions for 14 months. Watching our client retention numbers, our margin structure, our recurring revenue composition, our technical depth in the industrial power system space. The number on that term sheet was $94 million. I had not told my family. Not my father. Not Patricia. Not Derek. I sat through that toast with the term sheet sitting in the drawer of my home office in Charlotte. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Because everything that comes next only makes sense if you understand what was already decided. The acquisition conversation began formally 18 months before the birthday party. Though Diane had been positioning us for it for 3 years before that. She had identified Meridian early. She said, "They're going to want to acquire something in the industrial power system space within the next 2 to 3 years. The question is whether they want us, or our largest competitor. Everything we do in the next 24 months is about making the answer obvious." I said, "Tell me exactly what obvious looks like." She told me. In detail. In operational, financial, structural, documentary, detail. Meridian would want certain things. EBITDA margin above 16%. Recurring revenue above 25% of total. Client concentration with no single customer above 20%. Documentation and reporting that could withstand a forensic level of scrutiny. Technical depth that couldn't be replicated quickly. A management team that didn't depend entirely on one person, meaning me, to function. We spent 22 months building toward that picture. I restructured our financial reporting 3 times. I rebuilt our project management documentation from scratch with Diane's guidance. I renegotiated our major maintenance contracts to build real recurring revenue into the base. I hired a fractional chief information officer to modernize our technical systems. I brought on 2 additional senior project managers, both with more than 15 years of large-scale industrial work to formalize what had been, in some ways, concentrated in my own knowledge and relationships. It was not glamorous work. None of the work that actually builds something real is glamorous. It is methodical and grinding, and requires showing up and paying attention on days when attention is hard to find. I reviewed financial packages late on Sunday nights. I sat in quarterly board reviews and asked hard questions about every number that was moving the wrong direction. I had tense conversations with Diane about areas where we were behind and direct conversations with our operations manager about areas where we needed to be better. We were building the company, and simultaneously we were building the presentation of the company. The organized, documented, auditable version of what the company was and had been and could be expected to become. Both things are necessary. You need the substance, and you need the story that makes the substance legible. Meridian reached out through a professional intermediary in March. I played it carefully, neither too eager, nor too cool. By June, we were in substantive due diligence conversations. By August, we were deep in the process. That was when Rachel found Derek's emails. I want to tell you something about the moment I understood what they meant. I was sitting in Rachel's conference room. It was a Thursday afternoon. The windows faced west and the sun was low and the light was coming in at an angle that made the surface of the table look like something out of a photograph. Rachel had the documentation laid out, organized by date, by recipient, by the connection thread between each email and the 3 lost contracts. She walked me through it. Methodically, the way a good attorney walks you through evidence clearly, without editorializing, without performance. Just the facts in the right order so that the meaning arrives naturally. When she finished, she looked at me. I looked at the table for a while. Then I asked her to leave the room for 10 minutes. When she came back in, I had made the decision. I said, document everything. Everything. I want the full picture in a single organized file. And then I want you to keep it somewhere I can access it. I'll tell you when I want to use it. She said, you have a real legal case here. I said, I know. I'm not ready for that yet. She said, Mason. I said, I know what I'm doing, Rachel. She looked at me for a moment. She knew me well enough by then to understand that the decision was made and the conversation about the decision was over. She said, okay. The morning Diane confirmed our final valuation range with Meridian's lead partner, I pulled my truck into an empty parking lot on the outskirts of Charlotte and sat there for 11 minutes with the engine off and both hands in my lap. Not because I was shocked. I had been modeling the range for 2 years. The number was within the expected territory. I had known for a long time that we were in that range. I sat there because I was thinking about a kitchen table in Pittsburgh. About a 17-year-old boy with grease on his hands, explaining his plan for his life to a father who loved him and could not see him at the same time. You know what the ceiling looks like in that kind of work. I was 46 years old in a parking lot in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had just been told the ceiling was $94 million. I sat there for 11 minutes. Then I started the engine. Then I went back to work. The deal closed on a Thursday. 9 weeks after the birthday party. 61 days of due diligence. 7 rounds of attorney review. 2 full rounds of negotiation on structure, specifically the earn-out provisions and the treatment of the employment agreements for my senior project managers, because I was not going to close a deal that left my team exposed. 1 final call that morning that lasted 45 minutes and ended with the Meridian lead partner saying, We're very pleased to welcome Coal Integrated Power Solutions into the Meridian family. I signed 4 separate documents, each one longer than anything I'd ever read. The last one I signed at 11:42 in the morning. Diane and I shook hands in the conference room. She had tears in her eyes, which surprised me completely. I had known her for 6 years and had never once seen her emotional, and I told her plainly, "You were the most important hire I ever made." She shook her head. She said, "We built this together." I said, "Yes, we did." Rachel said, "Congratulations." 23 years. I said, 23. She said, "What are you going to do now?" I thought about it honestly for a few seconds. And I said, "Go home." I drove home. Carla was in the kitchen making soup, a white bean and vegetable soup she'd been making since the first winter of our marriage because she said it was the right soup for cold days. When something good had happened, and you wanted to mark it without making too large a production of it. She heard me come in through the back door. She turned from the stove. She looked at my face. I nodded once. She put the spoon down on the rest beside the pot. She crossed the kitchen without hurrying. She put her arms around me. I held her, and we stood in that kitchen for a long time. In the particular silence, that means there is nothing that needs to be said right now, that everything important has already been communicated, that the moment can simply be what it is. That was the celebration. That was enough. More than enough. I called no one in my family that day. No calls, no texts, no social media, nothing. I did not call Raymond. I did not call Patricia. I did not call Derek. I ate soup with Carla at the kitchen table. I went to the workshop for a while after dinner habit, and stood at my workbench and looked at the truck. I was in the middle of rebuilding and thought about nothing in particular. Then I went to bed. I waited 3 weeks. Patricia called first. 7:43 inches the morning. I was on my second coffee in the workshop. I let it ring twice. Answered. She said, "Mason." I said, "Patricia." She said, "I heard something." A pause. "Someone mentioned I want to ask you directly, did something happen with your company?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What happened?" I said, "I sold it." Silence. Then, "How much?" I said, $94 million. The silence that followed was different. It was longer, and its texture was different, not the empty silence of a conversation waiting to be filled, but the occupied silence of someone revising something large. The sound of a file being opened and examined after 30 years of not being touched. Finally, she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And here is where I had to be precise. Because this was the question I had been carrying around for a long time, and I knew what the right answer was. And I needed to say it without anger so that it could be heard clearly. I said, "When I started, no one asked. When I was building for 23 years, no one asked what I was doing or what it was worth or where it was going. When Carla and I came to Christmas, you sat us at a side table 8 years running. When I told you business was doing well, you asked if we could pay our bills. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true. You had 23 years to ask me what I was building. Nobody in this family asked. Not once. Not one person. So I didn't tell." She said, "Mason. That's not." I said, "It is. Patricia. It's exactly fair. I'm not angry about it. But I'm not pretending it didn't happen." I hung up. Raymond called 20 minutes later. Number I didn't recognize. He had to look it up somewhere, which meant he had wanted to call enough to make some effort to do it. That registered. He said, "Mason." I said, "Dad." He said, "I heard about your company." I said, "Yes." He said, "That son, that's a number." I said, "It is." He was quiet for a few seconds. "My father." who had always had an answer for everything, who had opinions on any topic you cared to raise, who had navigated the social geography of 30 years in a steel plant by always knowing what he thought he didn't have words. He said, "I didn't realize what you were doing. I didn't understand what you were building." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have paid more attention." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm proud of you, Mason." 3 words. I held them. They were real. Raymond Cole did not say things he didn't mean. That was one thing about him I had always known, but they arrived 30 years after the year I'd needed them to arrive. They arrived after the papers were signed and the number was in the press release. And the evidence was no longer possible to look past. I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I'm sorry for the things I should have said and didn't." I said, "I know." I said, "I need to go." He said, "Of course." Yes. I hung up. I stayed in the workshop for a while. Not upset. Checking myself honestly. Making sure what I was feeling was what I thought I was feeling and not something else. It was. I was okay. Derek called that afternoon. He called from the office line of his law firm. Not his cell. I answered. He said, "Mason." Hey. The casual hey of a man trying to recalibrate power in a conversation mid-air. I recognized it. I'd heard it in business contexts 100 times. I said, "Derek." He said, "So." A laugh the same frequency as the birthday party toast, but thinner. Lighter. Less certain of the room's response. $94 million. I said. "Yes." He said. "That's man, I had no idea." "Seriously. Why didn't you tell us? We could have been there for the signing." "We could have." I said. "We." He said. "The family." "Come on. We're your family, Mason." There it was. The pivot. "We're your family" spoken in the register of a man reminding you of an ongoing relationship. As if there had been no Christmas seating arrangements, no years of not asking, no emails to 3 prospective clients. As if family were a continuous, uninterrupted condition rather than something that needed to be maintained. I said, "How are things at the firm?" He said, "Fine. Good. Things are strong." The answer came too fast. "Listen, I want to talk to you about something. Things have gotten a little complicated on my end. Professionally. Some partner dynamics have shifted in ways that look, it's not simple to explain, but the short version is I have some liquidity needs and I was thinking. Since you clearly have resources now, if there was a way we could structure something. A loan with interest. A short-term arrangement." I said. "Derek." He said. "Yeah." I said. I found the emails. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own breathing. I said. 43 emails. March through December 2019. Carlisle Industrial. Meridian Facilities Group. Holsworth Development. You told them I had limited operational capacity. You told them there was management instability. You positioned yourself as someone sharing private family knowledge to protect their interests. All from your firm email address. "Nothing," I said. "My attorney has the full documentation. 3 contracts. Conservative revenue impact of $11 million. Enterprise value impact at acquisition approximately $25 million. You cost me $25 million, Derek." He said, quietly. "Mason." I said. "I need you to hear me clearly. I am not going to sue you. I've thought about it and I've made the decision, and it's done. But I need you to understand that I know. I have known for a while. I have had a folder in my attorney's office with your name on it for 3 years. And no part of what I built belongs to this family. Not the work, Not the risk, not the decisions, not the result. You don't get access to any of it. You don't get equity in the damage you caused. A long silence. Then, very carefully, very quietly. I was scared of what you were going to become. That sentence. I let it sit in the air. I said, you should have let me become it. It was going to happen whether you sent those emails or not. All you did was slow it down. He said. I know. I said. I can't help you, Derek. Not because I don't have the money. Because I know what you did when you needed me to fail. I'm not interested in a relationship that only runs one direction. What you do next is entirely your own business. I hung up. Carla was in the kitchen when I came in. She looked up. I said. He admitted it. That he was scared. She said, does it help? Knowing that. I thought about it honestly. I said. A little. She nodded. She handed me a glass of water and went back to what she was doing. What happened in the 6 months after that phone call is the part of this story that people always want to know about first. The collapse. The accounting. The what happened to them. I'm going to tell it to you. But I want to be honest about what that part feels like from the inside, because it doesn't feel the way most people expect it to feel. The ethics complaint against Derek was not his first. That turned out to matter. When the Pennsylvania Bar Association conducts a formal review, it doesn't assess incidents in isolation. It looks at the full pattern of a member's practice over time. Derek had 2 prior complaints on file, one dismissed, one settled quietly enough that it hadn't made the industry rounds. The new complaint, filed by a long-term corporate client with detailed documentary evidence and no particular incentive to negotiate, changed the calculus. The review took 4 months. Anyone who practices law understands what a formal ethics review looks like and what it means when the review is thorough and the documentation is clean. The outcome was not in serious doubt after the first month. He lost his partnership. The partners structured a buyout at a significantly reduced valuation from what Derek had expected. He was not disbarred, not at that point, but he was out of the firm, and Cole, Hartley, and Briggs became Cole, Hartley, and Associates, within a month, which was a message in itself, in a city where the legal community is small enough that everyone notices when a name disappears from a door. He had debt. Real debt. Partnership in a firm requires capital investment. And Derek had borrowed against his equity position, twice. In the preceding 3 years, he had a certain lifestyle, the right address, the right car, the private school for the kids, the membership at the right clubs that his actual income had been covering at the margins even before the partnership situation developed. When the situation became public, Natasha's family financial advisors apparently advised against further support. The marriage, by all accounts I received through mutual family connections, was under serious strain. Derek called me 6 times in the 3 months following our final conversation. I answered twice. The first time to confirm that what I had said was what I meant and that nothing had changed. The second time, because something in his voice, on the voicemail, told me I should hear him out fully before declining again. He was not the same man who had tapped his wine glass in the Highland Park Club. His voice was careful in the way voices become when people are managing something they haven't managed before, the gap between what they need and what they are capable of asking for, in a way that preserves any remaining dignity. He said, I made real mistakes. I know that. I said, yes. He said, I'm asking you as your brother. Family should be able to come to family. I said, family should. Yes. But I need you to understand what you're asking. You're asking me to help you after you spent 3 years trying to prevent me from becoming what I am. You're asking me to activate the family relationship in a way that was very selectively activated before tonight. He said, I know how it looks. I said, I'm not interested in how it looks. I'm interested in what's true. What's true is that when you needed me to fail, you didn't hesitate. I can't forget that. I'm not angry about it anymore. I genuinely am not. But I can't pretend it didn't happen, and I can't pretend the relationship is something other than what it is. He said. So that's it. I said. That's it. I wish you well, Derek. I genuinely do. But you're on your own from here. He said. Okay. He hung up. I never heard from him again. Raymond's calls over the following months were different. Not requests, exactly. He was too proud for that, and knew I had drawn the line on Derek explicitly enough that he understood where it was. But the calls were longer than our calls had ever been in my adult life. And they were real in a way our conversations had rarely managed to be. In one of them, he talked about the house. 40 years in the same house, and the maintenance was getting to be what it was. With a house that old. He wasn't sure what they were going to do. Not asking. Just telling. The way men of his generation tell things when they want you to hear them. I said. I hope you find a good solution, Dad. He said. Yes. Well. In another call he told me he thought about what I'd said. About not asking. He said he thought about it a lot. He said he didn't have a good explanation for it. He said that when you spend your whole career measuring things a certain way, you sometimes can't see things that don't fit the measurement. I said, I know that. Dad. He said. I'm sorry for what I missed. I said. I know. They sold the Pittsburgh house 6 months after the deal closed. Moved to a smaller place in the suburbs, easier to manage, less maintenance, closer to Patricia's church activities. Raymond sounded quieter in the calls after that. Not diminished. Just quieter in the way that happens when a man moves from a place that held a certain version of himself, and has to decide what version comes next. Patricia stopped calling after her 4th attempt. Her last voicemail was 7 sentences about family being important and hoping we could reconnect in the new year. I did not return it. A mutual cousin told me, some months later, that Patricia had mentioned me at a church luncheon, had said that her younger son, the one who had gone into electrical work, the trades, had sold his company and done extremely well for himself. Was very successful. Was doing very well. I thought about what it costs a person to update a file. How long it takes. What the arrival of a number large enough to be undeniable actually does to the story they've been telling. I blocked them all on social media. Not from anger. From clarity. There was no version of social media access that served any of us honestly at that point. I had nothing to show them and no interest in seeing what they posted about me. The morning after my last conversation with Derek, I got up at 5:45. Made coffee. Went to the workshop. I was in the middle of a restoration project, a 1972 Chevy C10 pickup I'd bought at an estate auction in South Carolina, not for any business reason. Not for investment, just because I had wanted to, and now had the time, and I spent 3 hours working on the cab before Carla came out with her coffee, and sat on the workbench stool and watched me without talking for a while. She said, "How are you actually doing?" I said, "Fine." "Honestly," she said. "Not performing fine." "Actually," I said. "Actually fine. It just feels like done. Like something finished." She said. "Done is good." I said. "Yeah. Done is good." We sat in the workshop for another hour. She read on her tablet. I worked on the truck. The dog slept in the doorway. Outside, it was a clear morning, cold, the yard still wet from rain the night before. Everything smelling of wet grass and engine oil and old metal, and the particular cleanness of early morning in the South. When the air hasn't been touched yet. I thought about my father at the kitchen table in Pittsburgh. I thought about Derek at the Highland Park Club, tapping his wine glass. I thought about Carla on our 3rd date asking, "What are you building?" I thought about 23 years. About the Sunday nights with the financial packages. About the quarter when we almost didn't make payroll and I transferred money from our personal savings without telling the operations team. About the day the Mid-Atlantic expansion pipeline went quiet and I assumed we'd been outbid. About Diane Walsh walking me through the due diligence folder and the acquisition model, line by line, in a conference room in Charlotte, while the future started to look like an actual thing. All of it. All 23 years of it. And then I thought. That was the point. That was always the point. Not the sale. Not the number. Not the calls that came afterward. The 23 years. The work. The showing up. The building something real from something that started as a one-man electrical operation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a second-hand van and a code book from the public library. The receipt came at the end. But the work was the whole thing. What I did with it. I maintained an advisory role with Meridian for 18 months post-acquisition. Part of the deal structure. I helped their integration team. I worked with their senior directors on the systems and approaches we'd developed. I helped them close 2 significant new contracts using methods that had been built over 20 years at Cole Integrated. Then I was done, and I was glad to be done. Diane Walsh moved to a CFO role at a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Raleigh. I gave her the strongest professional reference I have ever written. She was worth every year, every conversation, every Sunday night financial review. Rachel Torres is still my attorney. She will probably still be my attorney when neither of us can work anymore. When you find someone who does their job with that level of competence and integrity, you hold on. Carla is still a nurse. She went back to part-time after the sale, which was something she had wanted for a while, and she spends her extra time on things she has been wanting to do for years. A garden that is genuinely impressive, a volunteer program at a children's hospital, a very demanding yoga practice that I have learned not to schedule things against on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. We have the same dog, the same patio. The same quiet mornings that were always there. Just with more of them now. I set up a workforce development fund. Focused on trade apprenticeship programs in the Southeast. For young people who learn by doing, not by reading about doing. Who take things apart at 15 to understand how they work. Who get told by the adults in their lives that they can see exactly what the ceiling looks like before they've had any chance to find out for themselves. The fund has supported 53 apprenticeships in its first 3 years. 39 of those people are now working in licensed trades. 11 have started their own businesses. 3 have hired their first employees. I go to the job placements when I can. I don't make speeches. I just show up and talk to whoever wants to talk. I tell them, the work is the point. Whatever comes after is just the receipt. Keep your head down. Find the person who asks what you're building and means it. And don't let anyone tell you they can see your ceiling before you've had a chance to see it yourself. The last thing. If you have people in your life who decided what you are before you finished becoming it. People who carry an old file on you and haven't updated it. In 20 years and show no signs of starting. I want you to hear this. You cannot update that file for them. You cannot argue your way into a different category. You cannot perform your worth in a way that changes their calculation before they're ready to change it. The evidence has to become undeniable on its own terms. In its own time. And sometimes, not always. But sometimes, it does. What you can do is build. Quietly. Relentlessly. With the 1 or 2 people who can already see what you're going to be. The people who ask what are you building? And wait for the real answer and mean it, my father said. You know what the ceiling looks like in that kind of work. He said it when I was 17. At a kitchen table in Pittsburgh with coffee going cold in a mug between us. I thought about that sentence for 23 years. Not bitterly, not only bitterly, but as a question that stayed alive in me. Because it was a real question. What does the ceiling look like? How do you know the ceiling until you've built high enough to hit it? $94 million. That's what the ceiling looked like. My brother stood up at a dinner table with 31 people and made them laugh at the man who fixed wires for strangers. He was so settled in his version of the family architecture, so certain of who was the story and who was the footnote, that he couldn't see what had been happening for 23 years in the background of his confidence. I sat at that table, and I was already somewhere else. Already past it. The papers were 3 days from signing. The number was already real. And I said 6 words. "You're right, Derek. Somebody does." And I drove home. The work was the point. The work was the whole story. Everything else, the phone calls, the silence, my father's voice going uncertain for the first time I'd ever heard it. Derek admitting he'd been scared, that's just the receipt. You build the thing first. You do the years. You show up when showing up is the only thing available to you. You find the person who sees what you're building, and you build it together. The receipt comes at the end. And when it comes, when the number is real and the papers are signed and the room is finally quiet. You drive home and you have soup with the person who asked you the right question on the 3rd date. That's the whole story. That's always been the whole story. Keep building. This video is a work of fiction created for YouTube storytelling and entertainment. Names, locations, characters, and professional situations are entirely invented. Financial figures and all story details are fictional constructs for narrative purposes. If this story reminded you of someone who told you what your ceiling was, before you had any chance to find it yourself, then this story did exactly what it was made to do. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today.